process involved in extracting the tooth and drilling through the tooth begins with decoronation, which is done with a high-speed handpiece and a cross-cut fissure burr, usually from the buccal aspect. The objective being to section off the crown of the tooth on a horizontal plane, plus minus at the gingival margin level. Don't blow. When doing this, care must be taken not to cut too close to the mesial aspect so as not to damage the adjacent tooth, or too close to the distal aspect to damage the distal adjacent tooth. We can cut just short of those margins with a view to fracturing the crown of the tooth off in a safe manner. If we wish to cut through the tooth to a deeper level, the short or standard length fissure burr can be exchanged for a longer length fissure burr, if this is necessary. And then we can continue to cut through the tooth. Alternatively, one could reverse the cut and cut from the palatal as well. We'll continue to cut through the buccal. What we do following the cut is to place a straight elevator into the cut line and fracture the crown of the tooth. The benefit of this technique is that it now gives us a flat plane which is directly accessible visually, into which we can prepare the pilot hole for the further drilling. If the plane is not suitably flat or regular, if the fracture line is a little irregular, it may be worthwhile neatening it with a fissure burr to make it perfectly flat, just to be able to visualize the dimensions and the plane of the tooth more accurately. From this point, the pilot drilling can begin through the dentine surface. Another advantage of this technique is obviously that at this stage there's still no bleeding, and therefore visualization of the placement of the pilot hole can be done very accurately. The rule for pilot placement is that we err towards the palatal side of the surface of the tooth and slightly to the mesial. If we look at the instrumentation that we're using, there are going to be two surgical sets involved. The first of which is the external hex drill kit, the taper drill kit. You'll see that each line of instrumentation is color-coded. The first line being a 3mm diameter set in pink, which is not loaded in this particular set. The second is a blue line, which is the 3.25mm diameter taper drills. The next line is a grey or silver line, indicating the 4mm. The yellow is 5, and the green is 6mm. And then we have lengths of 8.5, 10, 11.5, 13, 15, and potentially 18 as well. The models that we're working on have got quite a deep anatomy, so I think preferably we're going to find that we'll need to use 15mm length drills through the tooth. The first drill I'm limited to 13, but we'll switch to 15s thereafter and just verify it to the sinus. I can just show you also, but in the set there's a second tier. If you remove the top deck, below you'll see that there's hand instrumentation, various wrench bits, and the adapters to the wrench. You'll also have a prosthetic surgical wrench in the set. Good. The second set that we'll be using is the Max set. You'll see on the lid Max. And this is not a fully populated set, but you'll see that there's a section for intermediate drills on the bottom left, which would provide for the taper drills that I've just shown you in the hex set, except that the range is limited to only 3 lengths, which for the most part would suffice for your Max protocols, but we know this model is quite deep, so we're going to use the X hex set apart from this, to have the longer drills. The second compartment is the dedicated max drills, which would allow for 6 diameter, 7, 8 and 9 diameter. The third compartment is for the taps, and again we have 6, 7, 8 and 9 millimeter diameter taps in the 3 lengths, 7 length, 9 length, 11 length. In the top left of the set we've also got primary drills, which are the twist drills, the parallel-sided twist drills, which are normally used for pilot preparation. In the protocol I've described to you, they would be used for drilling through the tooth. Again, there are various adapters to handpiece, and in the top right we've got the osteotomes or profile gauges, which can be used as verification parts if you choose to do so instead of the tap. Again, as with the first set, there's a removable tier to reveal hand instrumentation in the set below. There are various handpiece drivers and torque wrench drivers, which we'll look at subsequently. Right, so to begin with, if we look at our patient model, I'm going to be preparing the upper left molar, and we've got a sinus prepared in this side of the model, not in the opposite side. And in that sinus on your models, you'll find that there's a sinus membrane replicated there. I'm choosing to strip this membrane out of the model with the purpose of showing you the ingress into the sinus, which I want to illustrate because that's pretty much the clinical reality. In the absence of radiographs, which we obviously can't do here, I'm going to just reveal the anatomy by turning over the jaw and also showing you the tooth before we start. So this would be your radiographic examination. You can see this tooth is a fairly long tooth. The waist is somewhat on the short side. The length of the waist of the tooth is significant. The longer the waist of the tooth, by implication, the further apical in the socket the interradicular bone will occur, and therefore the shallower the ultimate depth of bone in your preparation will be. So a long-waisted tooth is less favorable than a short-waisted tooth. But the feature in this case is that we've got fairly long roots, but they're well separated from each other. There are many different configurations, as you all know. One of the common deviations from this configuration is where the distobuccal root is actually fused to the palatal root. The socket you see has got good interradicular bone, and in the clinical reality you may find that interradicular bone is not as generous as you see here because of the pathologies affecting that bone in many cases. The depth between the apex of the root and the floor of the sinus I'm not able to demonstrate here because of not having the equivalent of a radiographic image. All right, so what we're going to do first of all is to cut the crown of the tooth off, and you can see that in this case it's been pre-prepared for us. The crown has been cut off. And so the next step is to choose the site to go through the root, through the dentine. Normally, as I've said to you in the lecture, we would go mesially and palatally to avoid the danger zone between this first and second molar, which is usually a very narrow bony septum, which allows us to interfere with the second molar if we're not careful. However, for the demonstration, we're going to make a slight exception to that because the anatomy in the plastic model won't deviate the drill preparation to the distal to the same extent. We can take a liberty in this case by preparing more to the middle of the socket. But remember, for your clinical cases, always err towards the mesial and the palatal. So the idea here is to prepare a pilot hole, which you'd normally do with your high-speed handpiece. I'm going to use a harpoon drill or a pointed tip drill to do it in this case. We'll err towards the palatal, but in the mesiodistal we'll stay pretty much in the center point. We prepare an initial dentine preparation and then stop and look at it and make sure that we're happy with it. If this is off position, obviously you have the liberty now to adjust it. And that's the great thing about working through the dentine base, is that you can make any number of adjustments to the pilot hole position until you're quite happy with it. and it also separates the pilot position from the available bony septum. In other words, if you adopted the protocol of first taking out the tooth, the bony septum would dictate to you where you put the pilot hole, and as I've indicated to you on the slides, that would usually put you into a danger zone. So by drilling through the dentine, we're obviating that possibility. So if we're happy with this pilot position, we can now plunge through the tooth, taking into account bucco-palatal positioning and mesiodistal positioning. We want to get both of those dimensions right from the start. It's easier to make corrections with a smaller instruments in sight rather than to attempt to make corrections later. So as you drill through the dentine, be reminded of your mesiodistal position and your bucco-palatal position. And the idea here, if this were a short tooth close to the sinus floor, we would want to feel it approach the sinus floor or pop into or through the sinus floor. Right, I'm going to change to a twist drill now. I'm taking a 2mm twist drill, and I'm going to do the same thing, watching bucco-palatal mesiodistal all the time. Fix the areas, fix any deviations or areas early on in the cycle of events. All right, so this being a very deep site, I've got to use pretty much all of the length of the drill to reach the sinus floor, and you can see that I've made a small opening into the sinus floor. All right, we can use the next size tapered or parallel-sided twist drill if you so choose, or you can immediately start going to taper drills. I'm going to go to the next twist and do the same, watching bucco-palatal mesiodistal. All right, so if you look at the sinus side of this, you can see I'm just into the sinus floor. That's pretty much ideal. You don't want to be extending way into the sinus. There's no gain in doing that. And this would be the point at which you take a radiograph. Do it early on in the cycle. You disconnect the handpiece, leave the burr in sight, and take a radiograph and verify that you at the correct depth of placement relative to the sinus. That's really the only criteria on radiograph. Clinically, you verify mesiodistal positioning and bucco-palatal positioning. You want to be pretty much down the central fossa line to be correct. So we're happy with that. If I put it on a white background, you can see it a bit better. Okay, and just into the sinus floor. So from this radiograph that you've taken, you can pretty much determine the length of the drill that you need. And you'd remove the drill and now go to the tapered sets. Yeah, we're going to need a 15 at full depth to accomplish that. All right, so the first drill that I'm going to take will be a 3.25mm tapered, which is the blue range, and go to full depth, all the time controlling positioning. And this can go quite quickly now. Next one is a 4mm taper drill. You can see the gray band on this burr indicating 4mm. Go to the predetermined depth derived from the radiograph that you've just taken. Next burr is a 5mm tapered, having the yellow band indicating 5mm range. Okay. All right, so if I show you this, I've got my depth determination correct. The shoulder of the burr is exactly flush with the dentine face, and you can see that the nose of the burr is just into the floor of the sinus, which is pretty much ideal. So that's a 15. You can see how we're hollowing out the tooth, the walls are getting thinner and thinner. The next burr that I'm using is a green banded, which indicates a 6 millimeter diameter range. You'll see there laser markings on the shaft of the burr here, 6 by 15. Okay, so each of these is laser marked. Thank you. That's great. All right, we'll go to full depth to our dentine reference point. Right, I'm looking for the reference to dentine. I'm not deep enough yet. When you do this clinically, you'll be irrigating as you cut through the dentine and work intermittently, as I'm attempting to do here, so that you can reduce the heat generated by the burr, and also you can eject as much of the dentine debris as possible. All right, so we're pretty much up to the dentine reference point. Let's check the sinus. We're just into the floor of the sinus, which is pretty much perfectly where we want to be. All right, so we've prepared up to 6 millimeter drill, and the next step in our protocol is now to remove this tooth. What we would do is split the tooth through into its 3 compartments, mesial, distal, and a buccal cut. In the absence of a high-speed handpiece, we can't do that, so I'm going to cheat and just take the whole tooth out now. But you'll appreciate the 3 cuts that you need to make and the elevators that you remove it with. Just a technique point on the buccal cut. It's a good idea here not to go in vertically with a handpiece and cut towards the buccal, because there's a buccal strut of bone between the mesiobuccal and the distobuccal compartment here that's quite valuable. If you can preserve that bone, if it exists, be careful that you don't cut through it when you section the root. So the technique that we use here is to use the drill horizontally in this fashion rather than vertically, so that you can control the depth better and visualize it, and you don't have to cut right through. You just create a notch or a defect and then use an elevator to crack it through. So avoid cutting through on the buccal so that you preserve that buccal strut of bone. The elevator set that I'd recommend that you use is this Cole Schumacher set. It's a very nice set of instruments. The instruments have a pointed shape, being a heart shape or a little arrowhead. Thank you. And there's 3 configurations, being the straight one, which I have here, and then there's a forward swept arrowhead and a back swept arrowhead. You can see there, and they've got nice sharp points. So the way in which we use these, the straight one you can use in the notch that you've prepared and crack it through, and each of these crack it through. And then the forward facing one you can put into the distal compartment and elevate the root in this fashion into the center of the socket. So usually this will just tip into the center of the socket. And then the back facing one you use on the mesial aspect and tip the root into the void that you've created. And also then use the forward swept one on the palatal side to tip the root into the socket. Okay, as we can't split the root, I'll remove it. Interesting just to look at that and see where we've cut. We've pretty much cut through the waist or the core of the tooth dead center. That's not always going to be the case because the roots generally of a natural tooth will have more of a distal sweep. So what you might find is that you've cut very little of a mesiobuccal root, but you might have cut substantially through the distobuccal root. And what that can lead to is separation of the apices. So when you've got the tooth out, as we have now, the next thing you do would be to clear the sockets. And you would do that best with magnification and with light and with small socket elevators. The other thing is that we're now going to do preparation in a situation where there's a sinus opening potentially. There may still be membrane intact, but usually by this time there's a tear in the membrane as well. So we want to be careful not introducing debris through that opening, and also not irrigating any of the cutting that we do after this, so that we don't fill the sinus with irrigating fluids. So the next step in the protocol is to go to the taps, and I'm going to use a 7mm tap here, and I'm anticipating a longish implant, so I'll start with a 7x11 tap. The way in which we decide on the length is to make an assessment from the prior radiographs and where we estimate the buccal bone to be. But we have to verify with the tap in sight with a radiograph to be sure as to where we are. Right, so I'm taking the tap from the max set, and again you'll see that there's laser marking on this tap that will indicate it's got the word tap, D-tap, max 711, it says in laser marking there. Notice the shaft with a latch at the top where my fingernail is, and then the standard shaft, then the modification with a hex in this area, and then the tap itself, which I've described as a prototype, as a form of the implant, but with a strong spiral flute that you can see there. And that's a very efficient cutter. Notice that the nose of the tap is also benign. It's a completely smooth, blunt surface. If you run it against your glove, you'll see it doesn't cut. The intention of that has been that if we run up against the sinus membrane, that we're not hurting it. The twistrels that we've used, the tapered twistrels that we've used in advance, are much more likely to cut the membrane than the tap is. All right, so we're going to use the tap first of all in a slow speed handpiece. And you'll set this on implant insertion speed and torque. So it's very low speed and high torque. Always check it outside the mouth. You don't want to put it into the site and then find you on 10,000. Right, so we position it. Notice that the bone in the socket, the preparation that we've got, is quite far apical in the socket. And we've got a very good buccal strut of bone that's preserved. The mesial strut of bone is not evident. We're pretty much up to the mesial body of the socket, and distally we've got a strut of bone. All right, so again, we want to control the position of the tap. There's plenty of error possible here because the bone preparation that exists down there is very shallow. Most of the coronal aspect of this preparation is really just a void from the waist of the tooth. So the same responsibility exists throughout here, is that we control mesiodistal positioning and buccopalatal positioning. We put the tap into the preparation, set up the angulations, and then slowly start to rotate it in, checking as we go. If you're not happy at this point with mesiodistal or buccolingual, you obviously stop, reverse the tap, and then go back in, resight it, as we say. So this is starting to get really tight and torque out. This particular handpiece is set to 70 Newton centimeters, which is more than a standard motor unit will allow you. And the reason for that is that this particular make of handpiece has got a hex drive in the chuck system, so that allows it to generate more torque. But normally we'd torque out at 40 or 45 Newton centimeters. So with the tap in position now, you can see it's still too shallow. We're pretty much at the crest. If we consider the crest of this model to be bone, then we're probably still 1.5 millimeters above the crest, and we want to be about 2 below. And if we look to the sinus, we're still far off. So assuming that this is torqued out, we're now going to take an adapter, which is in the bottom of the tray, the max tray, and put it over the shaft of the tap. The particular adapter is this one. It's got the feature of a hex in its one end, which fits the shaft of the tap, the hex on that shaft that we've been talking about. And the other end of this adapter is the square drive, which will fit the surgical wrench. Now, just looking at its code, IWICL. Okay, this slides over the shaft and engages the hex. There's also a little rubber ring inside this so that it can't fall down. It's got friction to the shaft of the tap. Okay, so insert that, main thing being to be sure that it's over the hex. There it clicks over the hex. We now bring the surgical wrench to site. You'll see that the surgical wrench with its square drive, it's got a laser marking for in rotation. And if you flip it over, it's got a rotation laser marked for out. Okay, so we put the tap over the square drive, and then we must carefully control the direction that we apply force. If you look at where I've got the handle of the tap of the wrench, if I was to push this around to tighten it, I'll be displacing the implant to buckle, and that may be a negative. So it's advantageous here if you can reorientate the handle. It's not always possible depending on access. Rotate it past the 90 degrees to the arch, like this, so that the force you're using actually displaces the implant to palatal rather than buckle. So that's just a technique tip if you can accommodate it. All right, so let me turn it this way, and I'll slowly hand wrench this. Expect significant torque to be involved. And a further tip here is that if it gets really tight with hand wrenching, the way you deal with that is to reverse the tap and back off by 90 degrees to free up the cuttings and free the flutes, and then turn the wrench back around and re-advance. So it's really an incremental technique of forward and a little back and forward and a little back if the tap is getting tight. What we're looking to here is the buccal shelf of bone, and we want to be 2 millimeters below the buccal shelf. The other criteria that we're watching is the depth to the sinus floor. All right, so we can see that we're starting to approach the sinus floor, and the depth is a little short of 2 millimeters below. So I'll continue. All right, I'm going to back it off again, just to free it. Again, be careful of the direction of force application so that you don't tip the tap in the site. So I said, though you've got high insertion torque, you may not have bony walls right around the perimeter of the implant, and you can still displace it. So I've backed it off, turn the wrench back around, and I'm going to go forward again. Having a thumb on top of the drive also helps you control the direction and feel what you're doing. One of the great advantages of hand wrenching the tap is that you've got all your tactile sensibilities on board. You can feel what the primary stability is like, the torque is like, and the three-dimensional stability of the implant to some extent. Because of the great taper of these devices, both the tap and the implant, you can sometimes find that you'll go from having almost no torque resistance to maxing out on the torque resistance in as little as half a turn of the implant. And that's a feature of the taper. All right, so you'd verify this on radiograph again to see that you're just into the sinus floor, and you'd verify clinically that you're at the correct depth below the bony margin. And the best way to do that is to set a periodontal probe in this fashion against the surface of the tap. You can touch up against the metal and then take a measured reference to the buccal extent of bone. Sometimes you have very excessive recessions on the palatal aspects of these sockets, in which case you must certainly take your reference from the palatal. But rest rest the probe up against the top of the tap and make sure that you're happy with that measurement. Right, so in this case I'm going to go slightly deeper still. You see it's getting pretty tight now, so that's a good time to stop. All right, that would be your final radiograph. This tap is a 7 by 11. The possibility exists in this situation that you're not happy with the primary stability. In other words, you've already reached the sinus floor, you've gone in as deep as you can, but it's still rotating too easily. So what would you do in that case? You would back this out and go to an 8 millimeter diameter tap. The other possibility is that you reach the sinus floor, you've got good primary stability, but you're not deep enough below the crest of bone. So in that case, you'd back off the length. And there may be some situations where you would change both diameter and length to achieve what you're doing. And again, that's really the beauty of this technique, the versatility of it, is that if you start at the lowest point, being the 7 diameter, you've got increments beyond that to generate primary stability. And you've certainly got the variability of lengths to get it correct for your anatomical landmarks, being sinus floor and buccal crest. All right, so in this case, we're happy with a 7 by 11. There's no need to maneuver it any further. We're going to take the tap out. And because of the tapered nature of the tap, you'll find that just a couple of rotations make it very loose, and then it's very easy to take out. You can either put the handpiece back on it or just take it out, rotating with your fingers as I'm doing now. You'll find, as in this plastic model here, there's often a lot of cuttings on the tap. We've done the tapping without irrigation for the sake of protecting the sinus, and you'll find bony chips equally inside the cavities of the socket generated by the cutting of the tap. And what we like to do is to leave those in sight. They form to some extent an autograft, and you can, if you're concerned about anything, for example, if there's a defect in the mesiobuccal compartment, which there often is, you can pick up some of the cuttings off this tap with a little flat plastic instrument and pack them into the socket if you'd like to do that, to preserve the little bit of bone that you've harvested. All right, but that indicates the efficiency of the tap to cut. But very importantly to say again that the tap won't go anywhere without a pilot hole. You can't expect the tap to work into a blind hole and generate depth. It definitely won't do that. It's got a blunt tip. So you must be sure to prepare your pilot site adequately. All right, so we're ready to place the implant. What we need firstly is a connector for the handpiece. And that'll be in the base of the surgical set called an Icon X. This is the instrument. It's characterized by this barrel with a hole through it, which is just a vent which allows for cleaning. And then in the inside of the barrel, it's got a hexagon, which you can see there. And then it's got a circlip in this groove, a little spring clip, which acts as a latching mechanism. And then it's got the shaft. There's a hex on this particular version, a shaft with a latch. So it goes into the handpiece. All right, and again, on this particular W&H handpiece that's provided with a hex on the chucking mechanism, it'll engage the hex on the Icon, which protects the latch from torque distortion, torque loads. Check again that you're on low speed and high torque, which you would have been because of having used the tap on low speed and high torque. So we're ready with a handpiece to carry this implant. If we look at the packaging of the implant, we're choosing a Max 7 by 11. It's in a hard plastic case, which is just a protection for the inner sterile packaging. But you'll see the product reference here, the code of the product, and then a description in words, external hex Max 7 diameter by 11 millimeter length, which is reflected in the code 711. It indicates that it's sterile by radiation. The R is radiation. This circle with a cross and the 2 through it means that you can't sterilize it twice. It's a one-off device. If you've opened it once, it's done. There's a picture graphic of the actual
device as well. And down here you'll see there are 2 stickers on the inside of the packaging, which are peel back stickers with adhesive backings with a reference to the product and the lot number. These are meant for the patient record in the practice. Okay, on one end of the box, it then repeats the code and this coding here, and on the other side, a description of the manufacturer, the symbol for the manufacturer, Southern Implants from Irene, South Africa. It's got a reference to the other addresses, UK and America, but more importantly, there's a little tab here which you can lift. So people sometimes struggle to open the box on this side, but there's a feature provided for here with a little tab that lifts, and you can tear it away and open the box to reveal the packaging within. This is a cardboard backing in a plastic blister which contains the product in a sterile vial. So this you can still handle in a non-sterile fashion. The red tab here indicates that it has been through radiation for sterilization. To open this pack, there's also a feature in the form of this little ear, which you can bend forward and back to expose the paper backing, which just makes it easy to peel back again. And that reveals the inner sterile content, which you normally drop onto a sterile surface. Right, so in here we've got the little barrel with a cap on it. You can see the device within. The cap you can withdraw, and you'll see the yellow fixture mount, which indicates 5mm platform on the 7mm max implant. The mount, the pre-mount or the fixture mount there, you'll see has got a hex and a square feature, which allows you to pick it up with a handpiece drive that we previously assembled. There's a titanium ring in this packaging for the Max 7, a complete ring, which is a mount feature that protects the implant from touching the sides of this plastic barrel so that it doesn't contaminate itself with plastic product or polymer from the plastic. On the bigger implants, the 8 and 9 rather, you'll see that the ring is a semicircle, which allows it to drop away from the product. Okay, so that can fall down, it can fall on the floor, it doesn't matter. We bring the handpiece, just before I move on, inside this fixture mount down there, there's a little hex screw. That's the fixture mount screw that holds it to the implant. That's a 1.22mm hex if you need to tighten it. We pick it up by latching the handpiece. The circlip should allow it to be picked up against gravity. And you'll see that titanium ring, often it comes out with the implant and falls down. I just wanted to show you that, so you don't have to worry if that ring comes out and falls away. It's not part of the final product. Right, so there you see the implant with its yellow fixture mount. You'll see there's a laser marking on the fixture mount. That's 3mm from the implant, which is a very handy guide clinically to the depth of placement of the implant when you can't see it anymore. For example, once it's below the soft tissue margin, you can't really visualize the depth, but you may be able to visualize that laser mark, which is a 3mm datum. Right, so just check once more, we're on low speed and high torque. We'll then take it to the patient's mouth, preventing it from touching any soft tissue as far as possible, and tip it into the site. Again, you'll see because of its tapered nature that it goes quite far into the site immediately. We once again and finally want to check mesial distal positioning. It's still possible at this late stage to insert it in an incorrect position because the amount of bone we've got down there in the socket guiding us is very limited. The implant can be incorrectly sent down a wrong trajectory at this point. So be very sure just finally to control mesiodistal position and buccopalatal position. It's a good idea if you've got a second set of eyes on site to help you with one of the dimensions. It's not easy to watch both at once. All right, so we start incrementally. We're putting a lot of apical pressure on the handpiece, encouraging it to bite. If we feel that we're not on track with the correct angulation at this point, we can always reverse the implant and come back at it and resite it So just check your mesiodistal and your buccopalatal. Right, so I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to continue. Look at where that 3 millimeter laser mark is already. We'll keep that visual to guide us. Okay, so this is going to torque out. I can now remove the fixture mount, the Icon X from the fixture mount, leaving the implant safely in the site. And what we'll do now is we'll continue to hand wrench it. Something that we do pretty routinely as well is just to check the tightness of the fixture mount screw at this point. You can see the little screw down there. It's just a precaution. It's not something that you have to do, but something that we prefer to do as a precaution to make sure that the fixture mount is optimally tightened, and to protect the lugs from fracturing as you increase the loads. I'm just looking for the driver. Yep, so the driver that we need is a hex drive. You can see the 1.22 millimeter hex there, and on the other end it's got the square drive for the torque wrench. So you can pop that in. I'll show you with this drive. This is not a torque wrench, but you have similar idea, just to tighten that on the fixture mount screw, just to make sure it's nice and tight. And then we go to a hand wrench to seat the implant finally to depth. We need an adapter which fits the square drive, and on the opposite side has a hex, you can see there, which fits this fixture mount. Right, so I'll put these two together. Again, look at the angulation or the direction in which you're applying force here, and try and control the force so that you're not displacing the implant to buckle. You can expect quite a bit of torque required for this hand wrenching, and it's starting to torque out pretty substantially. If I look at where I am, I'm exactly into the floor of the sinus, and I'm 3 millimeters. It's not 3 millimeters, 2 millimeters below crest of bone. You'll notice that the implant torqued out suddenly and dramatically. It's practically come to a dead stop. And that's the feature of a tapered implant. And that's the very reason that it's important to tap, is that if you reach the bottom out point in the preparation, you simply can't continue beyond there. The taper bottoms out into that preparation. So if you don't pre-tap and you end up with the implant bottoming out in the preparation and it's not at adequate depth, then you've got a problem on your hands. And it's for that reason that I'm advocating the use of the tap in absolutely every case to prevent that from happening. Right, so that implant's well seated, it's got good primary stability, we've engaged the floor of the sinus, it's away from the buckle. You can see the extent of the voids around the implant. There's probably only 35 or 40% bone to implant contact in this case. The next step would be to put the 1.22 millimeter driver back onto the fixture mount screw and then remove the fixture mount. Right, so I've undone it, and then you can spin this out with a handpiece. There are drivers in the set, hex drivers in the set, which are latch grip, which you can reverse with your handpiece to make it quick and safe so that you don't drop anything. With the fixture mount coming away, I'll just show you the underside of the fixture mount with the 3 little lugs. You can see that very clearly. Those are the drive lugs. And within that, there's a void, a perfectly circular void. It doesn't have any hex feature, so it does not engage the top of the implant. And that's intentional, as I've said, to protect the hexagon on the implant. In extreme cases, what does sometimes happen is that these little lugs can be sheared off. As the implant bottoms out, if you try and go further with it, you can actually shear the lugs off. And it's for that reason that I've taken the trouble to stop and tighten the fixture mount screw. And that's an attempt to protect the lugs by having the best possible clamping force of the fixture mount to the implant. If the lugs do break off in this attempt to seat the implant, you'll find that they remain in these little holes in the implant, and usually you can just leave them there. The prosthetic seating shouldn't be affected by that, but obviously be cognizant of it and just verify it. Okay, the last remaining exercise is to choose a temporary healing abutment. And as this is a 5mm prosthetic table, we'd expect the temporary healing abutments to be yellow in color. And these varieties I have here are the 2-part. And the code, again, reflects the dimensions of the product. T for the 2-part temporary abutment. 5 is the diameter, which is abbreviated. It's actually a 5.5mm diameter. The BA is the code for yellow platform, which is a 5mm platform, and the 6 is the vertical height. So if we look at the actual part, it's got an interface at 5mm, and then you see it's got a tiny little bevel here, which means that the barrel of this part is 5,5, so hence the T5 for 5,5, BA for the yellow platform, and 6 being the vertical height. And then you see the screw. Okay, the second one that I had is a T6 BA6. So again, the 6 indicates a larger diameter, this time 6,5 diameter. It's BA being yellow platform or 5mm platform, and the height is still 6. So if you look at the part, it's got a 5mm interface down there. It's got a flare, which goes on a little longer, giving you the 6,5mm diameter across the barrel. So the criteria that I've indicated here is that we want to choose a temporary abutment that best fills the site so that we don't have strain to close the soft tissue against the temporary abutment to protect the apertures below. So I'm going to open this 6,5mm diameter abutment, the bigger of the two. There is a third diameter which I don't have to show you. It's a T7. So just to summarize that, we get 3 diameters of temporary healing abutment in the yellow platform or the 5mm platform, being T5, 5,5 diameter, T6, 6,5 diameter, and the absent member here, T7, which would be a 7,5 diameter. What we aim at doing is choosing the biggest one that allows us to seat the part without infringing on adjacent bone. Because the implant's quite deep, the risk here is that you touch adjacent bone and therefore preclude the seating of the implant. If you look at the 2-part temporary abutment, on its fitting surface, you'll also see that it's got a hexagon in the base. So one of the responsibilities of using a 2-part temporary abutment is to make sure that that hexagon is seated over the implant. That feature obviously doesn't exist on a 1-part. Right, it's one of the points of resistance from surgeons usually in using 2-part is that they've got the responsibility of seating the hex. Another little feature of the temporary abutment is the screw, you can see, has got a nib which is not threaded. It's probably, I don't know, 0.5 millimeter or 0.7 of a millimeter of the nib of the screw, which is just a smooth point. And the intention with that is to locate the screw hole easily in the implant. So if you approach with the part slightly horizontally, then you can see the nib go into the screw hole so that you know that you've located it, and then you simply pick up the part and you know that you're in the screw hole. So that's a very nice little feature which seems that not everyone has spotted. But if you use it to your benefit, it just makes life easier. You turn this down and you can feel it get snug and then back it off so that it's slightly loose. And then you'll see another feature of this temporary abutment is that there are 2 small dimples in the upper surface. And the intention with those 2 little dimples is that you can put a probe or a sharp instrument and wiggle it. And the reason you want to do that is to try and rotate it. If you can't rotate it, as in this case, you know that the hex is seated, or it's dropped over at least. And then you can tighten it up. And then at this point, you take a final radiograph and just make sure it's seated. Okay, it's pretty easy to see here that if we had a T7, we'd be touching this buccal strut of bone. This one is just free of it. So this is the biggest one we could possibly use in the site anyway. Okay, so what we do lastly here is put our sponge blocks into these voids. And I would do this in 2 or 3 pieces, just putting little pieces in the soft tissue aperture and just gently drawing the soft tissue closed, and then we're done.